Today, we're going to explore the darker, scarier side of the supernatural with 7 horror stories involving ghosts. Get ready for chilling tales, mysterious apparitions, and events that will make you think twice before turning off the lights. So settle in, take a deep breath, and come with me on this suspense-filled journey. Oh, and before any ghosts decide to show up, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell. That way you won't miss any of this terrifying content. Shall we begin? 1. The Phantom of the Theatre. In London, in the heart of the West End, there was an old theatre called the Majestic, famous for its dark stories and tragic past. For decades, the theatre was the scene of great productions, but also of mysterious events that frightened actors and spectators. Among the best-known legends was that of the tyrannical director Jonathan Blackwood, who ran the theatre in the 1920s. He was known for his cruelty towards the actors, demanding absolute perfection. After a disastrous opening night, Jonathan was found dead backstage. Some said he had taken his own life, while others believed he had been murdered by an angry actor. Since then, rumors of his presence haunting the theatre have persisted. Decades later, a failed actor called Edward returned to the Majestic. In the 1990s, he had starred in a play that ended in disaster, ruining his career. Now, with his life in ruins and seeking redemption, Edward decided to revisit the place where it all went wrong. He believed that confronting the past could help him move on. When he arrived at the theatre that night, the place was deserted. The building had been closed for years due to a lack of audiences and a growing reputation for being haunted. The facade was weathered, and the broken windows looked like empty eyes watching Edward as he pushed open the heavy door. The interior was even gloomier than he remembered. The chairs were covered in dust, the stage curtains were torn, and the air had a musty smell mixed with something metallic. Despite this, Edward felt a strange familiarity as he walked down the central aisle towards the stage. As he explored the empty theatre, he heard something that made his heart soar, the distant sound of applause coming from the auditorium. He stopped and looked around, but saw no one. Thinking it was just his imagination, he continued walking backstage. It was there that he found something disturbing, an old mirror covered in a white sheet. When he pulled back the fabric to reveal the weather-stained glass, he saw not only his reflection, but also that of someone else behind him. He turned around quickly, but there was no one there. "You're back," said a deep, cold voice behind him. Edward froze in place before slowly turning around. In the center of the stage stood a tall, imposing figure dressed in formal 1920s clothes. It was Jonathan Blackwood, or at least something that looked like him. "You should never have left," Jonathan continued as he walked slowly towards Edward. "The stage demands loyalty, eternal loyalty." Before Edward could reply or run away, the lights in the theatre began to flicker violently. The sound of voices echoed off the walls. Laughter, shouts, and indistinct whispers filled the air as if an invisible audience were present. Suddenly, figures began to emerge from the shadows. Actors dressed in old costumes appeared on the stage and on the auditorium seats. Their faces were pale and empty. Their eyes shone with a ghostly light. "Welcome to the cast," said Jonathan with a cruel smile. Edward tried to run for the exit, but found that the doors were locked. Desperate, he returned to the stage in the hope of finding another way out backstage. However, the more he tried to escape, the more he seemed to be trapped in an endless maze of dark corridors. Finally, he found himself back in the center of the stage under the floodlights. Jonathan was waiting for him along with the other ghosts. "You failed us before," said Jonathan as the other ghosts slowly surrounded Edward. "But now you'll have another chance. Forever." The spirits began reciting lines from old plays as they pushed Edward to the center of the stage. He tried to resist, but it felt as if something was draining his energy, as if he was being pulled into that dark world. The next morning, when city officials arrived at the theater to inspect the abandoned building, they found only absolute silence. However, some swore they heard muffled laughter and applause coming from the empty auditorium. And they say that to this day, if you walk past the Majestic at night and look through the broken windows, you can see a man on center stage, trapped in an eternal performance under the watchful eyes of Jonathan Blackwood and his ghostly cast. 2. The House of Whispers. When Emily received the news that she had inherited a house from a distant relative, she was surprised. She hardly knew her great-aunt Margaret, but the idea of owning a property seemed like a unique opportunity. The house was in a rural area of Scotland, surrounded by green hills and isolated from the rest of the world. Although it was a little daunting to live alone in such a remote place, Emily saw it as a chance to escape the chaos of the city and start a new life. When she arrived at the property for the first time, she was struck by the dark beauty of the house. It was an imposing Victorian building, with tall windows and turrets that seemed to touch the grey sky. However, there was something in the air that seemed heavy, as if the place carried a long-buried secret. The house was in good condition, but the walls seemed to whisper old stories that Emily still didn't know. On the first night, while unpacking, Emily heard something strange. It was a low, indistinct sound, as if someone was whispering downstairs. Thinking it was just the wind coming through the gaps in the old windows, she ignored it and went to sleep. But the whispering continued over the next few nights, always starting around midnight and stopping at dawn. Determined to discover the source of the sound, Emily began to explore the house during the day. She found old photos of Margaret and other family members she had never met. In one of the oldest photos, she saw a group of people posing in front of the house. They all looked serious, almost sad, except for a woman in the center who had an enigmatic smile. On the back of the photo was written, "Blackwood Family, 1892. As the days passed, the whispers became clearer. They weren't just indistinct sounds, they were fragmented words. "Watch out. She's coming. Don't trust." Emily began to feel shivers whenever she heard them, but something inside her told her that the whispers weren't threatening. They sounded desperate, as if they were trying to warn her of something. One night, while reading in the living room by candlelight, the electricity often failed, Emily heard footsteps coming from the hallway. When she got up to investigate, she saw a shadow pass quickly by the door. Her heart raced as she followed the shadow into the basement of the house, a place she had not yet explored. The basement was cold and damp, with stone walls covered in moss. In the far corner, she found a door locked with rusty chains. Next to it was a key hanging from a hook on the wall. With trembling hands, Emily unlocked the chains and opened the door. Inside was a small empty room, with walls covered in scratched marks and strange symbols drawn on the floor. In the center of the room was an old chair facing the wall. As Emily approached to take a closer look, she felt an icy wind blow past her and clearly heard the whispers, "Get out of here, before it's too late." Frightened, she ran out of the basement and locked the door again. But that night the whispers became screams, multiple voices echoing through the house as if dozens of people were trying to speak at the same time. The next day, Emily decided to look for answers in the nearest village. There she met an elderly man called Arthur, who seemed to know the history of the house well. "You should have sold that property," he said sternly when she mentioned where she was living. "That house is cursed." Arthur explained that Margaret Blackwood was known in the village as a reclusive and eccentric woman who rarely left the house. But the real mystery involved her mother, Evelyn Blackwood, the smiling woman in the old photo Emily had found. Evelyn was obsessed with the occult, Arthur said quietly. She performed rituals in that house, rituals to summon something that should never have been summoned. Emily asked about the room in the basement, and Arthur turned pale as he listened to her description. "That's where it all happened," he said. "Evelyn tried to bring something into this world, but she couldn't finish the ritual before she died." Back at the house that night, Emily felt more frightened than ever. The whispers were now accompanied by knocks on the walls and shadows moving through the corridors. She knew she had to do something before she completely lost her sanity. Determined to face whatever was happening, she returned to the basement with candles and salt to form a protective circle, something she had read about in books on spiritual protection. When she entered the room again, she felt the air become as heavy as lead. In the center of the ritualistic circle, marked out on the floor, appeared a translucent female figure, Evelyn Blackwood. "You need to finish the ritual," said Evelyn in a cold but calm voice. "Or she'll come for you." Emily then realized that the whispers were from the souls trapped in the house, victims of Evelyn's failed rituals, trying to warn her about something much worse, a dark entity still attached to the place. With instructions from Evelyn's spirit, Emily completed the ritual using the symbols on the floor and reciting ancient words written on the walls of the room. When she had finished, there was absolute silence, followed by a deafening scream from the depths of the earth beneath her feet. The next morning, everything was quiet again, but Emily knew that she would never really be alone in that house. And to this day, when the wind blows hard through the hills around the Blackwood estate, it is said that whispers for help can be heard coming from the dark windows of the whispering house. 3. The Child in the Mirror. In the quiet town of Whitby, in the English countryside, the Harper family had just moved into a Victorian house that seemed straight out of a fairy tale. The house, with its red brick facade and tall windows, was spacious and perfect for starting a new life, away from the chaos of the big city. Sarah and Michael Harper were excited to raise their 8-year-old daughter Lily in this peaceful environment. But what seemed like a perfect fresh start would soon turn into a nightmare. It all started subtly. Lily was playing in her room when Sarah noticed something strange. The antique mirror hanging on the wall was reflecting her differently. It was as if the reflection was slightly delayed, moving a second apart. Sarah thought it was just her imagination, or perhaps a defect in the weathered glass, but the sensation made her uneasy. Over the next few days, Sarah began to notice other disturbing details. When Lily combed her hair in front of the mirror, the reflection seemed to look directly at Sarah, even if the girl was distracted. Sometimes the reflection would smile, but Lily wasn't smiling. One night, while putting Lily to bed, Sarah casually asked about the mirror. "Do you like it, dear? It looks quite old." Lily hesitated before answering. "I like it, but sometimes Rose won't let me play with it." "Rose?" asked Sarah, feeling a shiver run up her spine. "My friend in the mirror," replied Lily good-naturedly. "She lives in there." Sarah tried to laugh off the answer, convincing herself that it was just the fertile imagination of a child. But something about the way Lily said it, so calm and serious, made her uneasy. The next morning, Sarah decided to tell Michael about her worries. He laughed and said she was exaggerating. "It's just an old mirror," he said while drinking coffee in the kitchen. "And Lily has an incredible imagination. There's nothing to worry about." But that same night, Michael was the one who noticed something strange. As he passed Lily's room to check that she was asleep, he saw her sitting on the bed, staring into the mirror. When he entered the room and called out to her, Lily slowly turned around, but her reflection remained still for a few more seconds before moving. Michael stood paralyzed for a moment before turning off the lights and hurrying out of the room. The next morning, he admitted to Sarah that perhaps there was something wrong. Determined to find out more about the mirror, the two began researching the house and its former inhabitants. It was then that they discovered something disturbing. Decades ago, a little girl called Rose lived in that same house with her family. She died tragically at the age of 8 after falling down the main staircase while playing alone. Intrigued and frightened, the Harpers decided to remove the mirror from Lily's room and store it in the attic. But this only made things worse. That night, Lily woke up screaming in the middle of the night. When Sarah rushed in to calm her down, she found her trembling in bed. "She's mad!" cried Lily through her tears. "You got her out of here. She wants to go back." Sarah tried to comfort her daughter, while Michael went up to the attic to check the mirror. When he got upstairs, he found it turned against the wall. But something seemed wrong with the reflection in the cracked glass. Even with the mirror turned away from him, Michael clearly saw a pair of glowing eyes watching him. Desperate for answers, the Harpers sought help from a local historian called Margaret Evans, who knew the legends of the region well. When they mentioned Rose and the antique mirror, Margaret became visibly upset. "There are stories about that house," she said quietly. "They say that Rose never left this world completely, that her soul was trapped in that mirror." Margaret explained that Rose wasn't just a passive presence. She wanted to return to the world of the living and needed to swap places with someone for that to happen. "If you don't do something," Margaret warned, "she'll try to take Lily." That night, the Harpers decided to confront the spirit directly. They put the mirror back in Lily's room and formed a protective circle around it using rock salt, something Margaret had recommended as a temporary measure against evil spirits. As they waited nervously in the room next to Lily's bedroom, they heard whispers coming from upstairs, followed by distorted, childish laughter. When they rushed upstairs to check on Lily, they found her fast asleep, but her reflection in the mirror was awake, looking straight at them with a cold smile. Michael grabbed a hammer and tried to smash the mirror while Sarah got Lily out of the room. But before he could strike the first blow, he heard a childish voice coming from the glass. "If you destroy me, she's coming with me." Michael froze as he saw Rose's face slowly emerge from the reflection next to Lily's sleeping face. With tears in their eyes and no other apparent option, the Harpers decided to follow the final instructions left by Margaret, to perform a ritual to free Rose from the mirror without allowing her to take Lily's place. The ritual was performed that very night under great tension. As they recited the words Margaret had indicated in front of the mirror, surrounded by lighted candles, they heard high-pitched screams coming from the glass, screams that seemed to be as much of anger as of pain. When they finished the ritual, the mirror cracked completely before exploding into pieces, leaving only absolute silence in the room. The next morning, everything seemed to be back to normal, except for the fact that Lily no longer remembered Rose or the mirror. The Harpers sold the house shortly afterwards and never spoke again about the events of that terrifying week. But they say that anyone who finds the fragments of that broken mirror can still see Rose's glowing eyes watching patiently, waiting for another chance to return to the world of the living. Room 313. On the outskirts of Budapest, Hungary, there was a decaying hotel called the Grand Orpheus. Built at the beginning of the 20th century, the hotel had once been a landmark of luxury and elegance, but was now in ruins, surviving only with occasional guests and unsuspecting tourists. Despite its worn appearance, the Grand Orpheus was famous for something darker. Room 313. Staff and guests avoided mentioning the room. It had been locked for years, and terrifying stories circulated among the hotel's corridors. It was said that anyone who spent the night there never came out the same, or worse, never came out at all. Some reported hearing muffled screams coming from the room on silent nights. Others saw shadows moving under the locked door. The best-known legend was about a woman called Ilona Kovac, a guest who had stayed in room 313 in the 1930s and was found dead in a horrible way. Since then, it was believed that her spirit haunted the place. Mateus, a skeptical young receptionist who had only been working at the hotel for a few months, didn't believe the stories. For him, it was all just exaggerated superstition to attract the curious. Determined to prove that there was nothing supernatural about room 313, Mateus decided to spend a night there alone. It was a cold, rainy night when Matthew picked up the rusty key to room 313. The hotel manager, an elderly man called Laszlo, tried to dissuade him. "You don't know what you're doing," said Laszlo with a serious expression. "Ilona doesn't want anyone in that room." Matthew laughed nervously and replied, "It's just an old room. There are no ghosts." With the key in hand and a flashlight to light his way through the dimly lit corridors, Mateus climbed to the third floor. The corridor seemed colder than the rest of the hotel, and the silence was almost deafening. When he reached the door to room 313, he hesitated for a moment before unlocking the lock. The interior of the room was just as decayed as the rest of the hotel. Dust-covered furniture, peeling wallpaper, and an old bed with sheets yellowed by time. However, there was something strange in the air, an oppressive feeling that seemed to weigh on his shoulders. Matthew turned on the main light and put his backpack on the bed. He brought a notebook to record anything unusual and his cell phone to record videos as proof that nothing would happen. "Let's see if these ghosts show up," he said aloud to himself. In the early hours of the night, everything seemed quiet. Mateus explored the room in search of anything out of the ordinary, but found nothing but dust and old furniture. He began to relax and even laughed at the stories told by the other staff. Around midnight, however, things began to change. While he was writing in his notebook, sitting in the armchair next to the window, he heard a faint sound coming from the bathroom, as if someone was scratching at the door from the inside. Matthew froze for a moment before getting up to investigate. When he slowly opened the door, he found the bathroom empty, but the mirror was fogged up as if someone had just taken a shower. On the foggy glass were fingerprints drawing incomplete words. Before he could understand what he was seeing, he heard another sound, this time coming directly from the bed behind him. When he turned around, he saw something that made his heart stop. The dust marks on the sheets had been disturbed, as if someone had just sat there. Matthew tried to stay calm as he grabbed his flashlight and started filming with his cell phone. "If there's anyone here," he said in a shaky voice, "show yourself." The answer came immediately. The lights flickered violently before going out completely. The only source of light now was his flickering flashlight. It was then that he heard it, slow footsteps on the floor creaking behind him, but when he pointed the flashlight in the direction of the sound, there was no one there. Suddenly a low, feminine laugh echoed through the room, cold and full of malice. Matthew felt a shiver run down his spine as he looked around frantically. "Ilona," he called out without thinking. The cupboard door next to the bed opened with enough force to slam against the wall. Inside the empty cupboard was something written on the wood. "You shouldn't be here." Matthew tried to run out of the room, but found that the door was locked from the inside, even without a key in the lock. Trapped and terrified, he began frantically going through his notes on Ilona Kovac in search of answers. Among the papers left in the notebook by other curious employees over the years, which he had collected, he found mentions of the reason for her death. Ilona had been murdered by her jealous lover while staying in room 313. She was said to have begged for help for hours before being strangled. But no one came to her aid because her cries were ignored by the staff at the time. Her spirit has remained trapped there ever since, full of rage against anyone who dared to enter the room where she died. The manifestations became more violent as the hours progressed. Furniture began to move on its own. Objects fell from shelves. Whispers filled the air like a ghostly choir. Finally, Ilona appeared before him, a translucent figure with empty eyes and hands outstretched like claws ready to attack him. She advanced slowly while Matthew retreated until he was trapped against the wall. Desperate to survive, Matthew shouted, "I'm so sorry, I didn't know." For a brief moment Ilona stopped, but then she whispered, "You abandoned me too." With these final words echoing in his mind, Mateusz lost consciousness as an invisible force squeezed his neck. The next morning, Laszlo found Matthew's unconscious body outside the door of room 313, with red marks around his neck, as if he had been strangled. He survived, but never spoke about that night again. The room was resealed by the manager, but they say you can still hear female giggles coming from inside on the quietest nights, and those brave enough to look through the keyhole swear they see eyes watching them, waiting for their next victim. 5. The Lost Girl's Doll. The Lost Girl's Doll. In the quiet village of Windermere, situated in the English countryside, the Carter family had just moved into an old house with a large yard surrounded by trees. The house, built at the end of the 19th century, had a rustic charm that delighted the parents, Sarah and Michael, while their 7-year-old daughter Lily was excited about the outdoor play space. The move seemed like the perfect fresh start for the family. Soon after the move, Lily began to explore the yard with enthusiasm. One sunny afternoon, while digging near an old tree with her small bucket and toy shovel, she found something buried in the soft soil. It was an old doll with a faded lace dress and tangled blonde hair. Despite its worn state, the doll's blue glass eyes looked incredibly alive. "Look what I found, Mom," said Lily with a beaming smile, holding the doll in her arms. Sarah found the object curious and a little disturbing due to its aged state, but she didn't want to disappoint her daughter. "That's nice, dear. Just be careful not to get your hands too dirty." Lily immediately started playing with the doll, naming it Rose. However, from that day on, strange things began to happen in the house. The first night after finding the doll, Sarah woke up in the middle of the night to hear soft laughter coming from Lily's room. Thinking that her daughter was up playing by herself, she went to check. Opening the door, she found Lily sitting on the bed with Rose in her arms, staring at the wall. "Lily, what are you doing up?" asked Sarah. "I'm talking to Rose," replied Lily calmly, without looking away from the wall. Sarah felt an inexplicable shiver when she heard this. "Darling, it's time for bed. Rose can wait until tomorrow." Lily hesitated before putting the doll down beside her and lying down again. But as Sarah left the room, she had the strange sensation that the doll's eyes were following her movements. Over the next few days, Lily's behavior began to change. She became more reserved and would spend hours talking to herself in her room or in the yard, always with Rose in her arms. When Sarah or Michael asked who she was talking to, Lily would reply, "With Rose and sometimes with Emily." "Who's Emily?" asked Michael once. "She's the one who gave me Rose," Lily replied naturally. "She lives here." Concerned about the changes in her daughter's behavior and the reports about Emily, Sarah decided to investigate the house's past. She visited the local library and found old records about the estate's former residents. It was then that she discovered something disturbing. In the 1920s, a family called the Harringtons had lived in the house. Their youngest daughter, Emily Harrington, mysteriously disappeared at the age of 8 while playing in the yard. Despite extensive searches of the village and surrounding area, Emily was never found. Sarah felt a chill as she connected the dots. Could that doll have belonged to the missing girl? And if so, why was Lily acting as if she was in direct contact with her? That night, while Michael was working late in the home office and Sarah was trying to sleep, Strange noises began to echo through the house, light footsteps in the hallway, and indistinct whispers coming from Lily's room. When Sarah went to check on her daughter again, she found something even more disturbing. Drawings scattered across the bedroom floor showing shadowy human figures surrounded by tall trees, clearly representations of the backyard. "Lily, who drew that?" asked Sarah in a trembling voice. "I drew it," replied Lily without emotion. "Rose showed me how." Sarah began to feel real fear for her daughter's safety. She tried to get Rose out of her room that night while Lily was fast asleep. But as soon as she touched the doll to take it away, she felt something cold like ice run through her hand and heard a childish giggle echo through the empty room. The next day, Michael finally agreed that something was wrong when he found all the first-floor doors open at dawn, even though he had locked them before going to bed. He also heard footsteps coming from upstairs while he was having coffee alone in the kitchen, but he knew that Sarah and Lily were still asleep. Desperate for answers, the Carters contacted a local historian called Arthur Blake to find out more about Emily Harrington and her connection with the doll. Arthur confirmed that Emily was often seen playing with a similar doll before she mysteriously disappeared. "There are rumors," Arthur said quietly as he looked at Sarah and Michael seriously, "that Emily never left this property, and that her soul may be trapped in that object." Determined to protect their daughter and put an end to the paranormal manifestations in the house, Sarah and Michael decided to get rid of the doll that very night. They explained everything to Lily, although she cried inconsolably on hearing that Rose would be taken away. "You can't do this," cried Lily through her tears. "Emily will be so angry." Ignoring his daughter's protests, Michael took Rose to the yard where he had originally found the doll and started digging a deep hole to rebury it. But as soon as he put Rose in the hole and began to cover her with earth, something happened. The wind suddenly increased, the surrounding trees began to sway violently, and a ghostly figure appeared in the dim moonlight, a pale girl wearing old clothes and holding another identical version of Rose in her arms. "Please, don't take her away from me," Emily said in an icy whisper before disappearing with the wind. The next morning, when the Carters woke up relieved to have finally gotten rid of the cursed doll, they found Rose sitting on Lily's bed again, as if she had never left. And ever since then, every night is accompanied by childish laughter echoing through the empty corridors of the house, laughter that doesn't belong to little Lily, but to the lost girl called Emily Harrington. 6. The Silent Lighthouse. The island of Blackmore, located off the coast of Ireland, was an isolated place surrounded by legends. Small and rocky, the island was home to a lighthouse that had been decommissioned decades ago after a mysterious tragedy. The last lighthouse keeper, a man called Thomas Grady, was said to have died during a violent storm in the 1930s. His body was never found, but local fishermen reported seeing him wandering around the island on foggy nights as if he was still doing his duty. Despite the rumors, the island attracted curious tourists and adventurers looking to explore the abandoned lighthouse and its dark stories. Henry and Claire were a couple of American tourists looking for unique experiences during their trip to Ireland. When they heard about Blackmore Island in a local pub, they were intrigued. The barman warned them not to go, mentioning the legends about the lighthouse and the spirit of the lighthouse keeper. But for Henry, an amateur photographer in search of impressive images, and Claire, fascinated by historical sites, the warning sounded more like an invitation. They rented a small boat and set off for the island on a cloudy afternoon. The sea was rough, and the mist seemed to move like something alive, enveloping the island as they approached. When they finally landed on the slippery rocks of the shore, they felt an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to weigh on their shoulders. The lighthouse stood in the center of the island like a lonely sentinel, its structure worn down by time and storms. Exploring the island was initially exciting. They found the remains of old fishermen's huts and trails covered in dense vegetation. Henry took photos while Claire took notes on what she saw. But as the day progressed, the weather began to change rapidly. Dark clouds covered the sky and the wind grew stronger. They decided to seek shelter in the lighthouse until the storm passed. The interior of the lighthouse was even darker than they had expected. The walls were covered in moss and saltwater stains. The air was heavy with the smell of rust and mildew. They carefully climbed the steps of the spiral staircase until they reached the main room where the lantern stood, now broken and silent. Henry started taking photos while Claire explored the surroundings. It was then that they heard it for the first time, heavy footsteps echoing on the steps below them. Henry called out for Claire, but she was standing next to him. There was no one else there. The footsteps continued slowly upwards until they stopped just below the room they were in. The couple stood motionless, their hearts racing. Suddenly, a deep voice echoed through the lighthouse. "You shouldn't be here." Frightened, they ran down the stairs to try to get out of the lighthouse, but found the door locked from the inside, something impossible since it hadn't been locked when they entered. The storm outside was roaring full force now. Lightning briefly illuminated the room while thunder rattled the walls. As they desperately searched for another way out, Henry found an old diary on a dust-covered table. It belonged to Thomas Grady himself, the island's last lighthouse keeper. The pages were stained with moisture, but still legible. The diary described Thomas's last days before his death. He talked about something that had appeared on the island during a previous storm, something he believed had come from the sea. "It's not human," said one of the diary's final entries. "I see its eyes shining in the darkness. I hear its voice calling me from the deep sea." As Henry read aloud to Claire, they heard footsteps again, this time closer and accompanied by the dragging sound of something metallic being pulled along the ground. They hid behind a table as the figure appeared in the doorway. It was Thomas Grady, or what was left of him. His form was translucent and distorted. His eyes glowed with a ghostly light as he held an old lantern in one hand and dragged rusty chains in the other. "You need to leave," he said in a deep, echoing voice, "before she wakes up." Claire asked shakily, Who is she?" Thomas pointed out to sea through the broken windows of the lighthouse. "She's out there, waiting." Before they could ask any more questions, they heard something coming from the shore, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from the depths of the ocean. The waves crashed violently against the rocks as something huge emerged partway out of the water. Black tentacles writhed in the light of the lightning. Glowing eyes flashed between the waves. Thomas turned to them again. "I'm here to protect you from it, but you've brought it to my attention." Henry and Claire realized too late that they had awakened something ancient and evil by setting foot on the island, something that Thomas had sacrificed his life to keep trapped there. Desperate to escape, they followed the instructions of the lighthouse keeper's spirit to unlock the door using a key hidden under the floor of the main room. As they ran through the storm towards the boat moored to the shore, they could feel the presence of that thing in the sea following them. Each wave seemed bigger than the last. When they finally reached the boat and began to row frantically away from the island, they looked back only once. They saw Thomas Grady standing at the top of the lighthouse with his lantern lit, as if he was watching both them and the thing in the sea. They never told anyone exactly what happened that night on Blackmore, but Henry burned all the photos taken on the island as soon as they reached the mainland. And they say that to this day, fishermen avoid going near that coast because they can sometimes see flashing lights in the abandoned lighthouse, even though it's been empty for decades. 7. The Midnight Train. It was a cold night in Vienna, Austria, when Elias, a middle-aged man exhausted after a long day at work, hurried into the train station. The clock was almost midnight, and he needed to catch the last train home. The platform was deserted, except for the distant sound of the wind blowing through the tunnels. The lights flickered occasionally, casting unsettling shadows on the stone walls. The train arrived punctually at 23:59. It was an old model, with wooden carriages and blurred windows, as if it had come from a time long before his own. Elias found it strange. He couldn't remember ever having seen such a train before, but tiredness made him ignore the uncomfortable feeling. When the doors opened with a metallic hiss, he stepped into the nearest carriage. The inside of the carriage was as old-fashioned as the outside. Seats upholstered in faded red velvet, glass lamps that swayed slightly with the movement of the train, and a peculiar smell of mold mixed with something metallic. Elias looked around and noticed that the carriage was almost empty, except for a few passengers sitting quietly. They were motionless, their faces turned forward, as if they were in a trance. Elias chose a seat near the window and settled in. The train began to move slowly, picking up speed as it passed through the dark tunnels. He tried to relax, but something about the atmosphere seemed wrong. The silence was absolute. There was none of the usual sound of wheels on rails or the engine running. Only the muffled sound of his own breathing filled the space. He looked again at the other passengers and noticed something disturbing. None of them seemed to be breathing. A man sitting in the opposite corner of the carriage had pale skin and his eyes fixed on a distant point. A woman further forward held a suitcase in her lap with skinny fingers that were too stiff to be natural. Elias felt a shiver run down his spine when he noticed that the passengers didn't blink or even move. Trying to shake off the growing discomfort, he looked away to the window. But outside, there was nothing but total darkness. No light from the stations or passing scenery. It was as if the train was passing through an infinite void. "Excuse me," said Elias in a low voice to the man sitting nearest him. "Does this train go to the central station?" The man slowly turned his head towards him, but didn't answer. His eyes were deep and empty, as if there was no life in them. Elias instinctively stepped back and realized that something was very wrong. He got up hastily and started walking down the corridor towards the next carriage, hoping to find someone who could explain what was happening. But as he passed the other passengers, he felt their gazes fixed on him, even though their bodies remained motionless. When he opened the door connecting the wagons, he found another corridor identical to the previous one. Worn-out seats, oscillating lamps, and more inert passengers with empty expressions. However, they seemed even more deteriorated. Their clothes were torn and covered in dust. Their skins had a greyish tinge like old corpses. Elias began to panic. He ran through the next few carriages, but each one was the same as the last. Undead passengers sitting in absolute silence as the train moved through endless darkness. Finally, he reached the last carriage and found something different. A hooded figure sitting alone at the back of the carriage. The figure seemed to be waiting for him. "You shouldn't be here," said the figure in a low, hoarse voice that seemed to echo inside Elias's mind. Who are you? What's going on?" asked Elias in a trembling voice. The figure slowly raised its head, revealing a pale face with eyes glowing like burning coals. "This is the midnight train," she said calmly. "It transports those whose souls are lost to their final destination." Elias recoiled as the words echoed in his mind. "But I'm not dead. I just got on the wrong train." The figure tilted its head slightly as if assessing him. "You may not be dead yet, but you're already lost." Before Elias could reply, the lights in the carriages began to flicker violently, casting distorted shadows on the walls. The inert passengers began to move slowly, their rigid bodies snapping as they rose from their seats and turned towards him. He ran desperately to the rear door of the carriage, trying to open it as the passengers slowly advanced towards him with clumsy mechanical movements. "You can't escape," said the hooded figure behind him. "Once on board the midnight train, your fate has already been sealed." Elias finally managed to open the rear door and saw only darkness beyond it, no visible track or landscape, just an endless abyss below the moving train. With no other choice, he jumped. When he opened his eyes again, he was lying on the tracks of the station where he had originally boarded. The clock read 0001. Only 2 minutes had passed since he got on the train. Confused and terrified, he got up quickly and looked around. The platform was as deserted as before, but in the distance he heard the distant sound of a whistle echoing in the dark tunnels. Since that night, Elias had never taken another train late at night. But sometimes he woke up in the middle of the night with the feeling that he was being watched, as if he was still in that damned carriage. And whenever he heard the sound of a whistle in the distance, he knew that the midnight train was still out there, waiting for its next lost soul. And those were the 7 horror stories involving ghosts. Which one did you find the scariest? Did any of them give you goosebumps or make you look over your shoulder? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear what you thought. And if you liked the video, leave your like because it really helps the channel grow and motivates me to bring you more terrifying stories. Oh, and if you're not subscribed yet, take the opportunity to subscribe now and activate the little bell. See you in the next video, or maybe somewhere haunted out there. See you soon.